Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mija Yoon. I'm the head of the Department of Architecture, and on behalf of the Department of Architecture, as well as the School of Architecture, Planning, and the Media Lab, I wanted to welcome everyone for this incredible, necessary discussion about mobility and the future of Boston's multi-modal transport. So today's panel, Mobility of the Future, Boston's Multimodal Transport Opportunities, is the fourth panel in a series of discussions among Boston design, planning, and innovation communities about the future of Boston and how efforts associated with the potential bid for the 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games might help shape and achieve that future. Tonight's discussion will focus on mobility, the ways in which mobility might reshape the future of the city and the region. Specifically, what are the challenges and opportunities of implementing transport solutions for 2024 and beyond? And what new modes of transit or multimodal transit alternatives lie ahead for Boston's future? To give us a bit of background, Amy Sennett, the Vice President of International Strategy and Assistant General Counsel for Boston 2024.
Thank you so much, Mija, and thank you all for being here. I do want to give you a little bit more background on this series that we are calling Boston Futures. This is a community discussion series, as Mija said, about the future of our city, the future of our region, and how the Olympic and Paralympic bid might help us achieve our shared vision for a better and brighter future. It's been great to see several familiar faces and a group of familiar faces grow over the series of conversations that we've had going back to May. The inaugural discussion, as some of you may know, was titled Pathways to Legacy. That was held at the Bowling Building in Dudley Square at the end of May. And we had a fantastic group of architects and urban planners who played key roles in planning for past Olympic Games in other cities. And we were able to discuss some of the best practices and lessons learned for creating lasting benefits in those host cities, and hopefully glean some lessons that Boston can apply to its future development and its bid process. Our subsequent discussions, the first titled Olmsted's Legacy, Landscape, and the City, which was hosted by the Boston Society of Architects in their space by South Station, and A Better Environment, Boston's Urban Coastal Sustainability, which was hosted by the Northeastern University School of Architecture, focused respectively on the possibilities for Boston's public realm, notably with the discussion of the possibility of the completion and expansion of Olmsted's Emerald Necklace. And then the discussion of sustainable coastal development led by experts from across Boston at Northeastern. Again, these discussions, as you'll see again tonight, tried to focus on local thinkers and innovators, planners, designers, architects, describing their vision for Boston's future and how the Boston 2024 Olympic and Paralympic bid could advance that vision. So if you have any questions or you're interested in seeing video of those past events, I encourage you to follow Boston Futures on Twitter, follow Boston Futures on Facebook, follow hashtag Boston Futures for the discussion tonight. And before turning it back over to Mija, I just want to thank again all of the participating hosts that make this event possible. Of course, led by the School of Architecture and Planning here at MIT, but also, as I mentioned, the Boston Society of Architects, the BSA Foundation, the Boston Society of Landscape Architects, the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, Northeastern University School of Architecture, ULI Boston, and the Venture Cafe. We've had a really broad and diverse group of people involved in planning these events, and I think, as we can see from the turnout tonight, that's resulted in a really engaging and diverse community discussion, and we're really grateful to those hosts and to all of you for being here. And then lastly, I just would like to thank the Boston Futures Steering Committee, a couple several individuals who've really devoted a significant amount of time to making these events a success. David Manfredi from Elkis Manfredi Architects, Carlos Martinez from the Venture Cafe, David Nagahiro from CBT Architects, George Thrush from Northeastern, Kishore Varanasi from CBT Architects, Charles Waldheim from the Harvard GSD, Mei-Jin Yoon, and some of my other colleagues at Boston 2024. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mei-Jin to get us started on our discussion for tonight. Thank you again.
For those joining a few minutes late, there's a great trick about this space. If you go up one floor, you can sit up there, and there are a few chairs actually up in that corner, if that helps. As we all know, urbanity and mobility are inextricably intertwined, and the history of cities are closely linked with the histories of mobility and the physical infrastructures across trade and commerce. Today, mobility continues to be an essential ingredient to a successful city. And by mobility, I'd like to frame it as a word or a term distinct from transit or transportation. While transportation suggests systems of transportation, mobility spans scales and means, and it's sufficiently broad to suggest that the systems and experiences of moving without implying specific modalities. It includes bikes, cars, trains, but also alternative vehicles, piloted driving, car shares, ferries, duck boats, skateboards, segways, and of course our feet. So while transit as a term transit as a term sort of implies engineering and efficiency, mobility can entertain inefficiencies, pleasure, choice, and interactivity. When we talked about successful mobility in cities, we are looking for diverse mobility ecologies, and that's why we have such an incredible panel today. Looking at urbanity and mobility, we see clearly two trends. The world is becoming increasingly dense and urban, with populations moving to urban centers, and at the same time, we see a decline amongst developed countries in terms of car driving. Younger generations of Americans and Europeans are choosing to drive less. American teenagers are choosing a mobile phone over a mobile car. This tells us several things. Historical models of urban and suburban are evolving in parallel to new mobility patterns and platforms. Looking at the growth and development of the city of Boston, there are a few things that are particularly important about mobility here. One, Boston is a highly walkable city, something that Boston 2024 has highlighted in its bid. And it's a rather well-served city in terms of public transportation. On the other hand, there's still a lot of work to be done, highlighted by the winter snow. Of course, there are transit challenges, and there are many neighborhoods that are still not connected, and plenty of modernization that needs to happen and innovation. So back to my first point, urbanity and mobility are inextricably intertwined and inseparable. This means it needs to be designed hand in hand in any master plan or urban vision. And it's exciting to have so many experts here across MIT and the city representing not only different modes of thought, but also modes of mobility. I'm delighted to introduce Eva Cassin-Noor, who will be introducing and moderating the panel of experts. They're assembled here today to discuss this topic. Eva is an assistant professor of urban and transport planning at Michigan State University. She has a Master's of Science in Transportation from the Civil Engineering Department here at MIT, and a PhD from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, also here at MIT. She's consulted for the Athens Airport for the 2004 Summer Olympics, the Vancouver Airport Authority for the 2010 Winter Olympics, and the Holy Mecca in 2009 for the pilgrimage planning. Her current work focuses on large-scale urban planning projects and on transport planning in very peak demands.
Thank you very much, Mijin, and thank you very much to all of you for coming. So I set up thinking about how can we moderate this panel in a way where I give every one of you a chance to voice your concerns, to engage with the panelists. So I asked each one that we have a focus on one, what is kind of the status quo? Just touching upon how does Boston look like right now? Then moving ahead, looking at what is 2030 and beyond. There have been a lot of like Go Boston 2030 who engages the local communities, asks for their needs. But also these panelists are supposed to talk about their visions, their futures for 2030, and how Boston 2024 and the Olympic Games could connect those visions and move those visions forward. Boston 2024, for example, has proposed key infrastructure projects like the extension of the Emerald Necklace, upgrades to green and red lines, and a demonstration of the Boston-Quincy ferry service. So we're basically inviting these panelists to talk about how these demonstration projects really merge with Go Boston 2030, looking ahead into what mobility might look like 2030, 2024, and beyond. So with this ado, I think we've had wonderful discussions, and I would like to introduce first Kent Larson, and he's directing the Changing Places group here at the MIT Media Lab. Since 1998, he has also directed the MIT's Housing Research Consortium and the School of Architecture and Planning. His current research is centered around four related areas: responsive urban housing, urban vehicles, ubiquitous technologies, and living lab experiments. He's also practiced architecture for 15 years in New York City and has work published in Architectural Records, has a fantastic book that I recommend everyone to read, Louis E. Kahn Unbuilt Masterworks. And since 1990, Kent has written for the Architectural Press on the use of advanced digital tools for architectural design and inquiry. So thank you very much for joining, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful panel.
It's great to see such an excellent turnout here at the Media Lab. Sometimes we do these events in the atrium and there are 10 people, so this is fantastic. I'd like to just mention quickly some of the initiatives in Boston that I think are in alignment and they support each other. Well, of course, there's the Olympic event. This diagram shows some of the infrastructure improvements that are proposed related to mobility. There is also, as Eva mentioned, a focus on new transportation, future scenarios, and I think this is raising a lot of interesting issues. Mayor Walsh, when he came in, he started an initiative committee that Ed Glazier is running to look at neighborhood innovation districts. And fundamentally, I hope this is about increasing the density and improving the mobility and diversity in neighborhoods that will enable creative interactions and innovation. Mobility is a huge part of that. And then there's the Boston initiative called Housing and Changing City, Boston 2030. And I love this program because Mayor Walsh is proposing basically to increase the housing stock by 53,000 units, but target those at people not served by market rate housing. So basically rich people are served by market rate housing, poor people by affordable housing programs. In between you have families, workforce, young professional, etc., not served, and I think this does need to be linked to mobility. Just a couple of thoughts about public transit. We don't really think about that in our group, but a couple of quick thoughts. Bus rapid transit systems are getting a lot of attention now. I think they're incredibly powerful. They're lighter weight infrastructure, and if done properly, they can move a lot of people above ground with light and views. So, and I'm excited to see that is part of the Olympic vision. I think even more interesting are projects like this. I've spent a lot of time in Helsinki. This is the Katsu Plus system, which is a shuttle-on-demand system using very powerful dynamic routing algorithms to pick you up and drop near your destination or near your origin or at it, and drop you off at your destination. And you see these systems happening in Japan. They're very agile, very lightweight infrastructure, something we should think about. We've spent most of our time with respect to mobility thinking about shared use systems. And this is a summary of the modes that we think are important, particularly in a district, thinking about the first and last mile. By far the most important one is the upper left, is walking. We need to design these communities for walking. Shared bikes, you have, I think, these lightweight transit systems that will link districts. And then we've been thinking in our group about new urban vehicles. The ones in the red boxes are the ones we've designed and prototyped here in our lab. I'll just mention a couple of them. This was a few years ago. This was a city car project. It had robot wheels, drive-by-wire, get rid of useless things like engines and transmissions so you can fold the car. The length of the car is the width of a conventional car. We prototyped this, tested it in the streets of Spain. I no longer believe in this project, though. This was an interim project that was interesting for its time, but for reasons I'll mention in a minute, it's a little out of date. We decided we needed to focus on much more lightweight urban vehicles. Most trips in the city are by one person. So this is what we call the persuasive electric vehicle. It's folded, so it could be integrated in with a hubway system, for example, without taking up much space. We realized that it's not really necessary to fold a car or a vehicle like this when you bring together these three elements, which are, I think, extraordinarily powerful. This is the future. When you bring autonomy with shared use, with electric drive, I think it changes the game of personal mobility. We're now working on a little lightweight, ultra lightweight vehicle, meets the EU regulations for a bike lane vehicle. It is designed for, in terms of the number of vehicles, to meet peak demand, but off-peak you have excess vehicles, so we transform it, in this case, to a goods-moving vehicle that can load and offload packages to autonomously. It's a little bit like a more rational version of an Amazon drone delivering packages. That'll never happen in the city. We've prototyped a fully functional version of this. We're now having the chassis fabricated in Taiwan. It's bike-like, it's low speed, it's very low cost autonomy, ultra lightweight, and it moves both people and goods. And with any luck, if we're successful, I will sit on this in September and operate it from Harvard to MIT and back again. So we'll see if it works. Autonomy is really, technically, it has arrived. This is our colleagues in Aeroastro, Emilio Frazzoli, who prototyped in Singapore with part of the MIT Singapore Alliance, a autonomous pickup system. This is a little video the students made just to show that it works. You see reading a newspaper, etc. The question is really, at this point, about the infrastructure in the city and the cost of the technology, which we're trying to address in our project in collaboration with our colleagues in Aeroastro. Now you can model these systems, and everything we do involves building a prototype and modeling its impact on the scale of the city. This shows Kendall Square. Everything in red is a parking lot. It's basically a waste of land when you have parking, particularly in a high-value space like Kendall Square. If you look over here, this is what happened. This is real data with private vehicles. You see the number of vehicles, parking, user type. If you move to shared, you can serve the population with about a third the vehicles, half the parking. But the real benefit is when you move towards shared autonomy. You can essentially get rid of parking. Only that one little red box is parking. Reduce the trip time and require maybe a third the number of vehicles to provide actually more convenient mobility. in the city. I'll mention housing, even though this is a mobility focus, because I think it's really necessary to address housing as part of the larger package to increase diversity and affordability. Former Mayor Menino was an advocate of micro-units to lure young people to the waterfront. Bloomberg, former Mayor Bloomberg in New York, same thing, designed, a group had designed a 300 square foot apartment. This is Bloomberg standing in that unit. It was a dreadful apartment in many ways, pull-out sofa bed and other amenities. So we thought, what if we could design a smaller apartment, 200 square feet, that was 3 times larger? And we do this, like with some of our other projects, through transformation. And so in this case, you have a queen-size bed, an office, living room for 8 people, etc. Now, I'm hoping that with the Neighborhood Innovation District focus, rethinking of mobility, it will allow a more efficient utilization of space and an increase in density, so you can have the good things that typically come with density, more creative interaction, better restaurants, etc., without the bad things, which is traffic congestion and lack of parking. So we prototyped this right upstairs on the 5th floor. These are the incredible actors that build it. We have a new version down the hall that we're working on. A lot of people have a lot of good ideas for systems. I actually think the most important problem, though, is community engagement and decision support. We just finished a project in Riyadh, a new district in Riyadh, the size of a neighborhood, about 1 square kilometer. We built a decision support system we call Cityscope. We did this with the Riyadh Development Authority. We divided 20 urban planners into 4 teams of 5, and they had 1 hour to design this 1 square kilometer district, getting real-time feedback. In this case, you're seeing walkability. The green areas are more walkable, the red areas are less. We did daylighting and energy performance. You get real metrics in real time on the dashboard that I showed. We did a workshop in Toronto where it was focused on density, proximity, and diversity. So in this case, people are placing commercial buildings in blue. You can see the traffic getting congested in red, like Google Maps. Now, as you add housing, they increase the probability that someone will walk to and from work, which lowers the demand for parking, which allows you to increase the density. And having these real-time feedback tools and iteratively explore lots of scenarios with different stakeholders with different values, I think, is probably the most important challenge. We're interested in other types of data visualization that can inform how well a community functions. This is a real-time geolocated Twitter visualization of Kendall Square. You can see the bright area right here. That's 3rd Street where the restaurants are. Up above the 2 bright buildings are the Media Lab where we are, the CSAIL. This dark building there is the Center for Transportation, U.S. government building. Not a single tweet coming from that building. So this is a nice proxy for activities of young people, which in the end is what we're interested in. We built a model of Kendall Square in the redevelopment area, did a workshop where people could iteratively explore different alternatives but get real-time feedback with real metrics as they explored them. Now this three-dimensional model is a great conceptual tool, but we're also experimenting with ways that people can get a more perceptual view of the proposal. In this case, what we call a view cube. It's like moving a drone over the site and seeing a view of it. So perceptual and conceptual. Modeling human interactions. If we're dealing with innovation, creative interactions, we need to have a way to model this in this case, 2 office buildings too far apart for people to interact. We bring in housing, increase the density until you increase the probability that people will interact and can look at restaurants and cafes, etc. Now, bringing this together, we do have a grant from the Barr Foundation to look at the design of the BRT, proposed BRT station in the area around it in Dudley Square. This is a workshop we'll do. BRT is Bus of Rapid Transit. It's like an above-ground subway system. Sorry. We do propose to build a version of our city scope focused on the transportation and looking at those three things I mentioned: density, proximity, diversity, and mobility systems in real time, to see if we can more easily reach a consensus with the community about all these systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And what I really liked about the presentation was tagging on what does mobility mean, how do these modes interact, and then looking at how important housing is and how important community engagement is for it. So let me briefly introduce our next speaker. Her name is Sheila Kennedy. Thank you for joining. She's a professor of practice of architecture here at MIT. She received a bachelor's degree in history, philosophy, and literature from the College of Letters at Wesleyan University. Sheila studied architecture at the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and received a Master's of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design here at Harvard. There, she also won the SOM National Traveling Fellowship. As a principal of Kennedy and Rayledge, right? Architecture Ltd. For over 15 years, Sheila has established an internationally recognized design practice that explores architecture, digital technology, and emerging public needs. So it's my great pleasure to have her here and present for us today the vision. Thank you.
I'm going to start with a terrible pun. And so forgive me for that. But when someone says, what's 2024 in Boston, I have to ask, what are you mean? So yes, you can hiss at me for that. So what I want to do in this talk is talk about water, which is often forgotten, yet it's very important to Boston and to Boston's future also. And so I'm going to do a kind of a quick mini case study on a project that we designed for New York City, a ferry terminal, a public ferry terminal. Talk a little bit about what it means to design a contemporary ferry terminal and what we could maybe extract for the future. And then I'm going to quickly talk about a tale of two cities very quickly, Hamburg in Germany and San Francisco, of course, on the West Coast in the United States. And then I'll just end thinking a little bit about Boston from a water perspective, which is a little bit the same as saying back to the future. So I want to begin with the public ferry terminal. This is a project that was realized about 18 months ago. We had a public clients, a sort of a triad, three-headed client of New York City's Economic Development Corporation, New York City Parks, and also the Department of Transportation. And of the three public clients, I can tell you that the most challenging and demanding was Parks, because they wanted animal art everywhere in New York. It'll come back. Okay, fine. So we're familiar with New York, missing one square there, but it will come back. And this is the site for the East 34th Ferry Terminal. This is a project that's quite comprehensive. It was launched by Bloomberg, and it involved 6 different ferry terminals, and my firm, KDA, was commissioned to do them all, and this is the kind of main headquarters. Now, the ferries took on quite a different significance after 9/11. As we remember, after that tragedy, it was really impossible to use trains, it was impossible to use the expressway, and it was impossible to project. It was impossible to use cars. So really, boats and ferries were the only means of transportation to evacuate really thousands of people from Lower Manhattan at that time. The East River Ferry uses this guy. This is a standard high-speed ferry. It is expanding. It serves LaGuardia, it serves Staten Island, it goes up and down Manhattan, and it's also serving, in the summertime, longer distance venues like Martha's Vineyard Woods Hole, Hyannis, et cetera, and Maine. Do you want me to operate it without the remote, or? Okay, all right. Did you say the chip is sunk or the ship is sunk? Anyway, this is our site, and you can see that we have a two-ferry system on the East River. The East River is a challenging river for ferry boats to kind of negotiate. So we have these two barges, and then we have the typical platform that you see there, where you pass from the land side to the water side. And it is a kind of a unique place in Manhattan, because it's really one of the only places where experientially you get that long horizon view.
And that's 34th Street?
That's 34th Street. Yep. Try this. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna do that. This is, I think, gonna work better. So just to tell you just a little bit about the project, it's been quite successful. It's catalyzed people's attention. It's brought people down to the Esplanade, the East River Esplanade. And interestingly, it's developed around it a portfolio, I think, of over $500 million of development all around that area, simply because there's a transportation mode that's been placed there. We like to think it has something to do with the building, but it's really the kind of impact on development that waterfront transportation can have. So basically, this is the setup. We have these 6 ferry landings, of which East 34th Street is the main terminal building, and you can see on the far right the site plan here with the 2 barges that I described. This is actually a multi-modal transportation center that involves buses, city bikes, and connections to the train. And what we tried to do in this project was to engage an old, but not yet defunct, U.S. Coast Guard system, which brought a digital layer to the city, which brought the possibility to have real-time passenger messaging, to have information for commuters on the ferry boats, and to have kind of real-time access through a system of GPS satellites. So it was pretty cool for us to have an architecture project that has its own GPS satellites. So our idea was to try to take this, which was used for old maritime Coast Guard applications, and amortize that to kind of expand the experience of the public realm. And you may not know it, maybe unclear, but this is a very large body of water that moves every day tidally in and out. And that movement of the water, the East River, is actually a very important kind of ecological flushing mechanism that keeps that water body clean, and it's really pretty important to the health of the fresh water of the city of Manhattan. So we wanted to try to make that evident to people. And together our team developed a way in which we could use these large daylighting oculuses or light wells that you see here in orange, not only to let daylight through this very lightweight tensile canopy in the building, but we also had a series of LEDs that were wrapped around this that were interactive, that responded to the movement of people coming off boats and coming onshore, coming offshore, and also to the movement of the East River water currents. And this is a first visualization that David Small and his team made. You can see here the 3 different circular light wells and the kind of flow rate of the East River, which is now moving from the bottom of the screen up to the top. And those little kind of pink lines where sort of the energy and interruption that it occurs when people walk through that system, that brings together the kind of flow of water, and the speed of water, and the direction of water, and also the movement of people. So the ferry has become quite popular, and on our website actually we have a video that goes with this slide. But basically we asked people who had been at the ferry what they liked about the ferry station, and also what they felt about the water. And it's sort of interesting to hear their remarks. But most of them had no idea that the water was even moving. Most of them had no idea about the kind of ecological services that the East River was providing. They were just getting into moving along on the surface of the water. Another thing that's quite important with waterfront mobility is how do you make a building that's maybe on the edge of the water where it's expensive to shut down the highways and bring stuff in. So this was the first public project in New York City that was primarily made off-site. Everything was fabricated off-site so we could get a better quality. And we could also bring it in very quickly. So for example, our passenger waiting area was mocked up first, landside, and then it was taken down, it was barged in and mocked up on site. And you can also see that budgets really matter. Because we wanted to add a public element, this environmental system with the LEDs and the interactive water system, we had to use very simple materials. So we used this very simple concrete block that you see here that was covered with the perforated aluminum that I showed you in the last slide. And you can also see here these kind of soft, sock-like things that are hanging down. Those will be the light wells. So this steel frame uses very little metal, and we were able to kind of dress the building like that in 2 or 3 days because all of that was fabricated off-site and brought on-site. So this is a view of the ferry taken not too long ago, what it looks like today. You can see the kind of moire effects of that curved wall, and also the windscreen for the passengers and one of the daylighting units up above. And what I kind of like is that you begin to see the form of this toroidal form in various different lighting conditions, so that the ferry station has a life to it. It's not the same building that you go to day after day after day. As your commute changes, as the seasons change, it changes as well. This is another view of it with the multimodal New York City bikes. So now I'm going to do the tale of 2 cities, just very, very quickly, a minute or 2 on each city. And I guess if there's one thing that I'd like you to kind of understand about the Hamburg ferry system is that it's very robust and vital to the city, and it's a linear system. Each waterway in each urban major city, and most major cities do have waterways, has a particular kind of figure. It has an organization. So Hamburg's is a linear river system. It's a little bit hard to tell on the screen, but you can see the Elbe River here, kind of moving along here, and all of this part of the city is served primarily by ferries in this multimodal system. So there's a complete integration between ferry service and their S-Bahn and Unterbahn, the underground and above ground metro lines. These are the Haga ferry boats. They're very cool, and they're ubiquitous in Hamburg. They are branded. They're this bright red color, and their graphics have been impeccably designed. They've got LED readouts so that you only need one person, and I think you can see in here, this is the captain. There's one guy who runs this whole boat. It's almost robotic. People get on and off. This thing automatically unfolds, the gangplank unfolds and retracts, and then comes back up again at each stop, and there are frequent stops. And the interesting thing, too, is that this is not, the Riviera. Hamburg is a northern city, it's very cold, it ices up, and still the ferries are going. And still, these people are using the ferries, and it's just that simple. There's an edge of the waterfront, there's a minimal bumper, and there's a ferry boat that comes up to it. No stress, no anxiety about falling in that icy water. We're all good. And for really large events, for example, for the International Building Exhibit, the International Baustellung in Hamburg, the main public gathering point, which you see here in this plan, this was a very large development plan that involved a lot of international architects and created 5,000 new housing units, and today has generated about 25,000 new housing units. This is all served by an expanded ferry system just for this event, which took place for 3 months. So this is that same point that I showed you in the other map. And you can see all of these ferry lines in this linear system that have been added to serve this main public event. And I think that could be really relevant for our Olympics. The next city in my tale of 2 cities is San Francisco. We're familiar with San Francisco, and this is a shortcut or a crisscrossing system couldn't be more different than Hamburg in terms of its figure. You know, here you have a giant obstacle, and it's not that black, dead square. The obstacle is actually the bay itself that prevents San Francisco really from being joined to the East Bay. And logistically, that means that SFO, the airport in San Francisco, is not joined to Oakland. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that difficulty. And instead, there's a ring that goes all the way around here that connects these 2 points, or will connect these 2 points with San Jose, which makes perfect sense for San Francisco. But wouldn't it be much easier if you could crisscross and shortcut that bay instead of building a bridge by having a ferry system? And that ferry system is in the process of being revitalized in San Francisco, and it will make going from SFO to Oakland incredibly quick. And it works, it complements, and in this case, I think improves on the metro system, the BART system, the Bay Area Rapid Transportation System. This is a ferry. It's a little bit more complicated than the one in Hamburg, which is sort of semi-robotic, but it's iconic. San Francisco, we really think about ferries, and San Francisco has found a way to really make the kind of ferry experience at the Embarcadero into a complete market that has absolutely transformed the development model for Soma, the area just a little bit south of Market Street. And it's crazy. I was there recently, and you can buy anything on a Sunday afternoon at the ferry station. You can buy sea lavender. This is fresh sea lavender that's grown apparently on the edge of the sea, and it's being sold here at the ferry terminal. So there's a lot of life, and the kind of life is actually the small-scale vendor, local, organic, local restaurants, food trucks, these kinds of things that actually populate the pier. And so it's reaching out to a different kind of commerce than what we typically think of in San Francisco. So now I just want to end thinking a little bit about Boston. I'm sure we're going to talk more about it. But I think, you know, it's a hub, right? Boston is a hub. So I think we have a hub and spoke system, and maybe even a hub and bespoke system. A couple of facts just about water transport. These are from the Converging World Calculator about carbon. A car takes about 0.19 kilograms of carbon per passenger. A rail, 0.06, but a ferry really 0.02. And it turns out that ferries are much more efficient in terms of these kinds of cross-cuts that they can make. So if we think, for example, about Howler and Yoon's Bosch-Wash Shareway, this is a recent project that Howler and Yoon have done, which brilliantly kind of gathers together various different kinds of land transportation and packages them in a kind of a tight, shared container and makes good use of the land on either side. But if you look through the icons really quickly on the left, we don't see a ferry. How can we add to this idea of sharing and to this idea of efficient route transportation with waterways as well? This is Tony and Fiona's Digitarian self-driving vehicles. Kent, I put that in there for you. But these are their kind of a dystopian vision of what happens when we are driving self-driving vehicles around. Well, one thing that happens is that they need to be on something. So we live in a world that's covered with tarmac. And the cool thing about the ocean is that it's a smooth surface. It's both striated and smooth, and that you can move anywhere on it. You don't need that tarmac. So I think that the future of Boston is like back to its past. We all know that the waters are rising, and why don't we take advantage of that to really generate new kinds of urban landscapes that can be a bit more resilient and that could partially begin to accept and alleviate the damage from these waters. So we already have, this is a Rolls-Royce robotic cargo vessel. This is robotically unpacking cargo vessels. So I think we can also imagine that there could be robotic ships, large ships. This may be even easier to do than self-driving cars, to have self-driving ships on the ocean, perhaps self-driving ferries that could really expand our current rather paltry water taxi and ferry network. So amazingly, this is a map of Boston of 1954. It looks like it's much older, but I'd like to draw your attention to the area near where we work here, just a little bit north Roxbury, edge of Boston. This is the Newmarket area. And of course, that was all water through the Fort Point Channel. So what would happen if, for the Olympics, we actually reclaimed some of that land and we got rid of that asphalt and changed the character a little bit of Newmarket? 20, 30 years hence, will we be having trucks, refrigerated trucks, that take food from California and bring it to Boston? Or will there be another, more resilient way of dealing with the kind of urban food problem? Because if we could do this, we would have a hub and spoke system that would connect communities like Chelsea, like East Boston, like Roxbury, to the harbor systematically for the very first time. So we can talk about it, but I propose a kind of a hub and spokes for Boston 2024 and beyond. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. I think that was a very strong, very compelling argument why we should look into ferries here in Boston, and especially as there are so many cities around the world where we can learn from. But the vision that Sheila laid out, I think it's much stronger of using the resources that Boston has as a city for the betterment of our mobility here. So let me briefly introduce Wendy Lindman. She's the Executive Director of Walk Boston. Wendy came to Walk Boston with 25 years of experience in urban planning, spanning all modes of transportation, as well as experience in master planning, smart growth, and environmental review. She holds a Master of City Planning from MIT and a Diploma in Urban Design from the University of Edinburgh. She also serves on the Board of America Walks and the National SRTS Partnerships. Among Walk Boston's ongoing initiatives are Transportation for Massachusetts, a coalition working to create walkable, transit-accessible, and transit-served communities, safe routes to schools, and we are really looking forward to having her here and laying out her vision for Walk Boston.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to see so many of you here. I'm happy to follow boats, which are probably the second oldest form of transportation, but really the oldest is walking. And walking is really the most basic mode. It's not flashy. It's certainly not new. And I decided that you were going to get lots of PowerPoints, so you don't really need any illustrations of walking. I think we all know what it is. But it is really the core of a community that works well for everybody. And I think we've come to think about it in a lot of different ways. So there's a movement that's called 880 cities, which means if a city or a community is good for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old, then it's good for everybody. It's obviously at the core of mobility for people of all abilities. When you talk with people in the work on mobility for people with disabilities, walking is the first thing, the most basic thing that you think about. And it's one of the ways that, for example, as we're teaching children in schools how to get around for themselves, children with disabilities are a primary audience for that, because many people who aren't able to drive themselves are perfectly capable of moving around on their foot or in a wheelchair, rolling. Walking and rolling is another phrase that a lot of people use. Walking is free. You need a pair of shoes, but really that's within reach of almost everybody. A lot of the modes that I think we think about in the future, and we're talking about have a price, but walking, actually, we all come equipped pretty much ready to do that. It's democratic. It puts everybody at the same level. You don't look. People drive different kinds of cars. They spend different amounts of money on some of their mobility choices, but walking, really, it's the same for everybody. And it's also an absolutely critical part of our sense of community and the social life of communities. And when we think about places that we like to be, pretty much, without exception, they're walkable. Being in a place, it could be the heart of a dense city, it could be the woods, but thinking about places that aren't walkable, probably none of you dream of going to hang out for a weekend in, a highway interchange. Just not there. So when we think about what's important for communities, walking is absolutely at the core. So to start, a little bit on the status quo of walking in Boston. So, first of all, we have the highest walk-to-work share in the United States for a major city. That's good news. We have close to the either the lowest or close to the lowest pedestrian fatality rate in the United States. We have a really growing use of transit in Boston and in the surrounding communities. And one of the things Walk Boston thinks about a lot is that transit and walking go hand in hand. One cannot exist without the other. So when we think about transit systems, we really need to be thinking about walking systems. And that's something that we have sometimes forgotten in the United States. Obviously, within many parts of Boston, we have thought about it, but it's something that we need to think about and keep in mind. And then another statistic that I think is really important to think about is about 35% of Boston households do not own a car. So for some people, that's a choice. They live in places that are very walkable, but for many people, this is an economic necessity. They can't afford a car. And when you actually look at the population, broadly, if you eliminate everybody who's under 16 who can't drive, many people with various disabilities who can't drive, people who can't afford a car, and then many older people, a huge number of people. We think that everybody drives, but really that's an expression. It's not true that everybody drives. Everybody walks. So that's one of the reasons we need to be thinking about walking. So I just described some of the ways in which Boston is doing a really good job on walking and has some great stats. There's still some things that we need to work on. Some of the people in the audience know because we work with them every day on these things. So we need to fix our traffic signals. All the high-tech things that we were looking at, and GPS and mobility, Boston still does not have traffic signals that work very well or are coordinated very well for pedestrians or even for cars. We need to slow traffic down. We need to repair sidewalks and make sure that every corner has curb ramps. We need to clear snow off the sidewalk, because a great sidewalk that's covered with snow doesn't work as a part of the mobility system. And we need to think about making our neighborhoods as walkable as downtown. So then the next question we were posed was, what will it look like in 2030? And in some ways, I think the future of our cities and the future of walking looks a little bit like history. Until about 100 years ago, cities were designed as walkable places because pretty much everybody was walking. That was the mode of transportation. And now I think as we engage with cities in newer and deeper ways, as we see the dropping numbers of people who want to drive cars every day, I think what we're going to be doing is thinking about looking back a little bit. And I love the idea, for example, of thinking about walking in boats. I mean, that is how many people got around in the past, and maybe there's a future there. They're both, obviously, from an environmental standpoint, very, very strong contenders. The other thing that's really important to think about in Massachusetts is we have a really strong history of walking and building communities at a walkable scale. If you look at a map of communities in the Boston area, many of them are built essentially with a 3-mile radius from the center to the edge of town. And that was because in colonial America, everybody was required to go to church on Sunday, and a 1-hour walk was considered a reasonable walk to church. And so the communities were not bigger than about a 3-mile radius. And if you drop a 6-mile sort of template on communities around Boston, it actually fits many of them. So we know how to do this in Massachusetts. We actually know how to think about walking. So why do we need to take walking so seriously? Well, as I said, it fulfills the basic transportation need. It's inexpensive by comparison to the other modes, both for the individuals who are choosing it and for the infrastructure that the public needs to invest in. It's, by the way, absolutely critical to good health. And I can give you an entire presentation about the ways in which walking contributes to health, but it's not just cardiovascular. It's cognitive health, it's mental health, it's joint health, you name it, you should be walking. Human beings are designed for walking. Good walking is good for business. And again, Walk Boston has a whole presentation that we take around the state about why walking is good for business. But walkable places have higher real estate values, they have higher retail sales, they have happier employees, and they have lower costs for municipalities. All of those things come from walkability. So, what does it mean to take walking seriously? And I think this is where we start to think about what does it mean for the Olympics to take walking seriously. First of all, we need to integrate walking with transit. or any other new modes. When I see some of the new modes that people are talking about and shared services and autonomous vehicles, et cetera, I think, but where's walking in that picture? Because really it's the human beings in those vehicles, it's the human being that's getting off the train that we care about. So let's make sure that we're putting that in the picture as well. We need to think about pedestrian networks and connections throughout. We need to think about the pleasure of walking and what do we do to make it pleasant. We need shade. We need benches. We need accessible public restrooms. All of those things go into a good walking environment, whether it's every day or for the Olympics, but for the Olympics it's writ large. We need to be thinking about those things, and we need to scale our communities right. We need to think about the block scale. We need to think about the mix of uses on the street, the variety of destinations. All of those things go into walkability. Slowing down traffic, I'll just repeat that 4 or 5 times, but that is the number one thing we need to do to make our cities more walkable. And thinking about beauty, thinking about engagement with the environment, thinking about moments of joy as you're walking. What can you see? How can you interact with other people? All of those things go into the walking environment. And then thinking about it from a multimodal standpoint. Transit, vehicles, boats, bicycles, all of those things are connected actually on foot. So all of those pieces we need to be thinking about walking. So again, to bring it back just for a minute to the Olympics, one of the things that Walk Boston thinks about a lot is not so much the end of the trip at the venues, because we're pretty sure if we're going to have an Olympics that there's going to be a lot of care and feeding to get people from transit to the venues where they're seeing the sports. So what we think, a way to think about legacy for the region is the other end of the trip, where people get on the transit that they're going to take to get to the Olympics. Those are the places that are going to be hard to make sure that we're thinking about. So, you know, the clusters of hotels, the inexpensive hotel clusters that are further out from the city that have nearby transit, but don't have very good walking connections to get to transit, we should be thinking about that. If we're looking at the way that the neighborhoods or the communities outside Boston may host venues, thinking about those places. What's the walkability there? I have to believe that if we end up with a very large venue at Whitehead Circle, there's going to be a lot of attention paid to walking, and to walking to Whitehead Circle from South Station, from Broadway, from Andrews Station, etc. But let's think about the other ends of the trips as we're thinking broadly. Near the venues, thinking about really slowing traffic, really not having much traffic near the venues, letting those places be really primarily for pedestrians. Separate walking and bicycling. We love the bicycling world. We work with them all the time, but walkers and bicyclists shouldn't be mixed, especially when there are a lot of them. Think about shade. This is the Summer Olympics. It's going to be hot. You know, a long walk in the shade can be pleasant. A long walk today in the sun is not pleasant. So we really need to be paying attention to that. And then what's going to remain after the Olympics? Safer street crossings for everybody, more handsome and comfortable sidewalks, better connections to transit, and better wayfinding. We haven't really begun to talk about that. Massachusetts this is a place where Massachusetts really suffers by comparison to other places. There are places in the world when you go as a tourist that you can actually find your way around with good signs. That's not true here. I think it's part of the mystery of Boston, but if we're going to have the Olympics, we need to undo some of that mystery. And if we want, we can take the signs down afterwards and let people go back to having to ask. But if we're going to really have tens of thousands of people trying to find their way, I think we should probably tell them how to do that. So, that's walking. Thank you.
I think she's made a fantastic and very fundamental case of why walking is important for everyone, and especially as you deal with larger and larger masses of people, walking becomes the key mode to get from A to B. What I also liked about her way of phrasing it around is environment, aesthetics, and basically using what Boston already has and building on that to get a better legacy out of the city. As the next speaker, it is my great pleasure to introduce Carlo Ratti. He is here at MIT, a professor of practice, and directs the Accessible City Lab. He graduated from the Politecnico di Torino and the École Nationale de Pont de Chaussée in Paris, and later earned his MPhil and PhD at the University of Cambridge in the UK. authored over 200 publications and holds several patents. His work has been exhibited worldwide at venues such as the Venice Biennale, the Design Museum Barcelona, the Science Museum in London, GAFTA in San Francisco, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His digital water pavilion at the 2008 World Expo was hailed by Time magazine as one of the best inventions of the year. He has been included in Esquire magazine's Best and Brightest list, in Blueprints magazine's 25 People Who Will Change the World of Design, and in Forbes magazine's People You Need to Know in 2011. Paolo was a presenter at TED 2011 and is serving as a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council for Urban Management. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Don't believe all of that. Plus it was People You Need to Know in 2011, so you can forget about it now. So I'll share with you some of the work we're doing here at MIT at Sensible City Lab, and in particular about mobility. I want to start with this picture. You know, that's a picture that people used to be really fascinated in the 1990s. At the time, people thought actually our world would become increasingly virtual, and physical space would be less and less important. There is actually Gilder, 1995. Well, he said we are we were going. I don't remember what he said, but basically, basically he was thinking that cities would die, and cities are leftover baggage from the industrial era. Well, the first thing, what does it tell you? The first thing is, first of all, never predict the future, because 20 years later, somebody comes and no prediction could have been more wrong than this one. We now know that actually cities over the past few years have been thriving. That's a picture from China. China itself is planning to build more urban fabric than all of humanity ever built. We know that half of the world's population now lives in cities, and this number might swell to 5 billion by 2030. So what has happened really, we think, is that digital and all this real-time information and networks and what we've layered our cities with hasn't really diminished the importance of physical space. This, I think, what we see tonight here with all of you, all of us together exchanging ideas is testament to that. But actually, it's really a new condition. It's a condition which is in between bits and atoms, in between the digital and the physical. It's funny that we're here next to Hiroshi, who was one of the pioneers in this space about combining, making bits tangible, and combining these two realms. And this is providing and opening up new possibilities in many different spaces, including transportation. For instance, we can actually today describe a city like this. This is a visualization by Pedro Cruz, who was in our lab at MIT. It was a moment in New York about taking billions and billions of data points in Lisbon and looking at how the city lives like a living organism. We couldn't do this a few years ago, and that opens up incredible possibilities if you want to study the city. And then if we take the data and we analyze it, it's the same data in New York. Every dot is a taxi pickup or drop-offs. What you see here is actually the airport. You see JFK, all the terminals, and then you zoom out, you see Manhattan, and you see all the boroughs. All the dots, a taxi pickup and drop-offs. And then you can ask yourself, what if people could share transportation more? Now, if you want to ask that question, you can frame it in a mathematical way, is imagine you want to take everybody to destination when they need to be there, give or take a few minutes. What would be the minimum infrastructure you need to do that? It turns out if you try to solve it with traditional systems, it's quite difficult. If you use linear programming, you cannot cope with the incredible amount of data we have today. But what we developed here is something we call shareability network. So we analyze the data from New York. That's a paper that came out last year. And what we found is quite interesting. Is actually that in New York, you could take everybody to destination when they need to be there, but with 1/3 less cars, almost 40% less cars than what we have today. So if we are ready to share more mobility, we can actually utilize the infrastructure in a much better way. It's interesting that actually some of these results were seen by Uber. Uber has since started collaborating with us at MIT, and Uber Pool was launched along the same lines of how we can actually share mobility more and cut the cost of the infrastructure. We heard Kent before talk about self-driving. Self-driving is interesting. For us, it's not about the fact that you don't need to keep your hands on the steering wheel. It's not about the fact you can shamelessly text while you're driving. But actually, this is what a self-driving car sees. It's a LiDAR that you put on the car and it gets a 3D scan of the environment, a little bit like the human eye. And the exciting thing is that then you blur the distinction between public transportation and private one. So in the morning, the car can give you a lift to the office, and then can give a lift to somebody else in your family, or to anybody else in the city. So what you've done, you blur the distinction, and if you combine this, which is car sharing, with what we saw before, which is ride sharing, you can potentially have a city such as Boston, where you take everybody to destination when they need to be there, but with 20% of the vehicles we have today. And imagine how different Boston would be, or New York, if you were to run it just, with one car out of 5, and the rest, can, as we heard before, can be much more walking, much more cycling, and so on. Now, we like autonomous vehicles. We also like drones in general. So here is a project where we actually looked at drones to solve a very important problem on this campus. This campus is very messy. Some of you coming from outside might have seen it. Every building has a name. I mean, people get lost, especially Harvard students. So we try to help them.
Welcome to MIT. Where would you like to go? Follow me, please. The Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab is the largest research lab at MIT.
To your right, the Media Lab. To your left, the Data Center.
Follow me, please. Approaching your destination.
You have arrived. Welcome to Sensible City Lab.
Goodbye.
So the actor who was the funny thing is that the actor who was playing in the movie was playing with the prototype. He's actually from Yale, so he was very happy to play the Harvard student. So anyway, very briefly, just a couple additional things about mobility. Of course, we heard it before, human power mobility is going to be essential. We see more and more of that. We've been working on that, like other groups here, in looking, for instance, at bicycle, with the project we did in Copenhagen, with the city of Copenhagen called the Copenhagen Wheel. We started thinking about how actually digital can change the experience of riding a bike. We came up with this idea.
Copenhagen Wheel. The wheel that turns your ordinary bike into a smart electric hybrid. Quickly and easily, with no additional batteries or wires. The Copenhagen Wheel allows you to capture the energy dissipated while braking and cycling, and save it for when you need a bit of a boost. Controlled through your smartphone, the Copenhagen Wheel becomes a natural extension of your everyday life. The Copenhagen Wheel is your personal trainer, sensing your effort level and providing you with real-time feedback about your fitness and exercise goals. The Copenhagen Wheel also enhances your experience in the city. It connects you with things a cyclist wants to know: upcoming traffic congestion, road conditions, and pollution levels. Choose to keep your data, or share it with your friends and other cyclists through social networks like Facebook. As you ride, you also collect green miles. It's similar to a frequent flyer program, but good for the environment. Elegant, responsive, smart. A new mode of transport for a rapidly changing world. So turn on your life and turn on the city. The Copenhagen Wheel.
Well, that was the first idea. That's actually the first prototype tried by the mayor of Copenhagen, the city of Copenhagen. There's a video with the two mayors trying it out. I will skip it. in years of time. But actually, this is now last year it was named by Time Magazine one of the best inventions of the year. But it's the important thing is actually the work was done here at MIT was licensed by a startup, which is now producing the wheel. A licensed MIT patent is producing the wheel here next door in a garage. Called Super Pedestrian. So actually that is becoming is part of the innovation ecosystem here in Boston. And the final thing I want to finish with, I showed you some example of mobility. We're doing a project for the Olympics in Rio, which is actually about immobility. And I want to share with you, we're working with water. Again, water is a very important ingredient in the city. And in particular today in Brazil, where there's a terrible water crisis. And so we were asked to commission to design this pavilion that would become both a symbol for the Olympics, but also a place to experience and learn about water and water conservation. And what we did here was, it's a little bit like when you got the Segway. You see, there's a lot of real-time control and movement, micro-movement, in order to keep it stable. And in this case, we say, well, can we build an architecture, design an architecture built by subtraction from Lagoa? Lagoa is this beautiful lagoon in the middle of Rio de Janeiro. Can we build it by subtracting? But if you want to do that, usually it's very difficult. Usually if you are on a barge, you're above water. You're never with the experience of being inside the water. You're just staying at the level of the water. And the reason is that you want some additional flotation capability so that if more people go there, then you don't sink. But if you use, again, real-time control, like a submarine, you can really stay on the waterline. And you can have this experience of creating a space and an architecture by cutting space out of the water. So those were the first sketches, a place where you can go. It becomes like a plaza, like a pavilion, where you can have, you can listen to a presentation, have real-time information about water and data on the city. And kind of something that can have an educational purpose for Rio. I mentioned this because this was commissioned, then the mayor became a great advocate of it, and hopefully we'll be able to build it by next year. But the Olympics is also about education, is about looking at some of the key issues in the city and seeing how we can solve them. And I think we got a great opportunity for Boston 2024. Thank you.
Very much. So I feel like this presentation was very much an advocate for how can we move throughout a city, how can we make rides shared, how can we make transportation modes shared, yet focusing on the individual and focusing on the city in itself. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Stacey Thompson. She's the Deputy Director of the World Streets Alliance, a nonprofit advocating for biking, walking, and transit to create safe streets in vibrant communities. Stacey oversees the World Streets membership program events and communications, and previously she served as the Director of Events and Sponsorship at Ceres, where she developed a strategic focus, content, and communication strategy for Ceres major events. She has a Master of Arts in Social Justice from Loyola University in Chicago and a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Education from St. Vincent College. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I always feel like such a not cool geek when I come to these things because I come from the social sciences and I know nothing about autonomous vehicles. There are no robots in my presentation. And actually, what is the focus of this presentation is pretty simple. We can talk about all of these great modes and all these different ways people are trying to get around. But ultimately, this is what's happening. We're all just trying to get somewhere. We're trying to get to work, we're trying to get to school, we're trying to get to our kids' soccer practice, we're trying to get to a show. It doesn't matter if you're taking a bus or a train or a fancy car or a hoverboard 30 years from now. What remains the same and what was the same 100 years ago, what will be the same at the Olympics, if they're here, what will be the same in 2030 is that you've got a city full of people and they're all just trying to get somewhere. If we talk about Boston today, I think that there's a perception that we're at a standstill. How many people have complained about their commute in the last week to someone? Yeah, in the last month? Yeah. Boston tends to be a place where people aren't happy about what's going on with their commute. And I don't think that we're unique. But I would say a couple of interesting things have happened. Since 1987, Car volumes in the city have fallen by 31%, and what's more interesting is that car shares have skyrocketed. And when you dig into the data a little bit more, you find that, let's see if I get this statistic right. In 5 years, the number of cars per person has dropped from 59 out of 100 to 49 out of 100, and we're seeing that continue to decrease. Since 2001, the pedestrian flow has increased across the board, and Wendy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe 1 in every 3 trips is done by walking. It's still probably the primary way people get around this city. And since 2007, bicycling has more than doubled, and we're actually seeing a 30% increase per year. So this statistic is only going to skyrocket. And of course, since 1964, MBTA ridership is at its highest levels and growing despite the snow and frustration. So regardless of what technology comes or does not come to this city in the next 15 or 20 years, there are clear demographic shifts, and probably the most important one is this population statistic. We are talking about an increase from 550,000 to 600, wow. A lot, right there. You can read the slide. We have a beautiful city. A couple of things, you can't really see it on the side, but I'm gonna scoot through them, is a couple of statistics about people, whether they're walking, driving, taking public transportation, by generation. And what I actually found most interesting about these stats is not the differences, but the similarities between generations. There's often a perception that multimodal transportation use is something that young people are doing, but it's not. You see some differences, but not huge differences between generations, and we're all shifting toward wanting to have more opportunities and more variety in our lives when we're trying to get somewhere. So what does this mean if when we're trying to get to 2030? I often say, again, we immediately jump to, let's have bike lanes all over the city, or what's the new cool mode that we're going to have? But for me, it's let's just stop talking about that for a second. Let's step back and let's imagine what our city would be if we said, no, our streets are simply vibrant public spaces. Our streets are for personal interaction, they're for physical activity, they're for community and fun. They're not just for cars, they're not just for bikes, they are for people to interact with each other and to get somewhere, and they accommodate everyone. If we start at that premise, then everything that everyone has said here tonight changes. It's not about that mode, it's about getting people somewhere. I think a classic example of this is Commonwealth Avenue. Who here has been on Com Ave? Who's taken the beeline ever? You all survived, congratulations. This is designed for a piece of Commonwealth Ave that was recently unveiled in March. We're pretty excited about this. We worked with folks at Walk Boston, Boston Cyclist Union, to get this design. But what's interesting is it falls pretty flat on the screen, but what you're looking at is a complete street. You're looking at a sidewalk that accommodates a lot of people, it's nice and wide. You have a cycle track that is double protected, so there's a physical barrier, and then parking so that bikes and cars aren't crossing around each other. And then you have the travel lanes, then you have a nice covered space for the person who is waiting for the train, and you see this on both sides. In addition to that, you have signal priority for the Green Line and the 57 bus. So what this translates to in real life is 100,000 people using that 3/4 of a mile every single day, getting around faster. Imagine a world where instead of every single time a little construction project comes up, we have to fight for 3 feet of sidewalk space or fight for a bike lane. What if in 2030 we simply, this isn't technology, we just said every single street that we redesigned in the city of Boston has to be built like this. We have to think this way. We have to think about people first. It's a simple concept. I know. Don't laugh at me. I'm asking you to imagine this. And what's important here is to think about statistics. So this is just asking someone simply, would you bike next to a car? And you've got a tiny little group of people saying, absolutely no problem. 60% saying, I'm interested but concerned, and then 30% saying, no way, no how. So some simple shifts could really give people more opportunities on our streets, and it's just about rethinking those opportunities. And of course, having opportunities for people who don't want to bike, because 30% is a substantial number of people. Bus rapid transit was brought up recently. I'm curious, someone asked what bus rapid transit is. How many people here are unfamiliar with bus rapid transit? I want to get a feel before I start. Oh, we're great. This is awesome. So there was a study recently done that talked about BRT in the city of Boston, and it suggested that we rethink our bus system. And whether you're a proponent of BRT in Boston or not, I think it's important to really look at the elements of gold standard BRT and think about what makes them great and how we might be able to implement them in the city of Boston. You know, a couple of things like platform level boarding, whether it's for BRT or something else, can really make life better for someone who happens to be in a wheelchair, for people who have strollers. Off-board fare collection, that can make or break your experience on public transportation. How can we start taking elements of something like this and making our city better? And this is an image from the report. I highly recommend folks, you know, this is a 10-minute presentation, but all of this is online. These are 5 corridors. There were 12 corridors identified in this report, but these 5 corridors were sort of picked out as ripe for bus rapid transit in the city of Boston. And I bring this piece up not just because I think we should automatically use BRT as a priority in our transit system, but because this is an interesting intersection with the Olympics. The IOC requires designated bus lanes for athletes and officials, I believe I'm getting that right. And some of those corridors directly align with where we would be moving people from point A to point B. So whether we get the Olympics or not, starting to think about these overlap points is really key, and thinking about how we can pilot new and different ways of using something as simple as a bus in our city. And the last piece that I want to get to sort of, I think, brings us full circle again to simple ways of getting around. I have been saying we often focus on a public transit system, but let's not forget that we have the vision of Olmsted and Eliot, who really envisioned an active transit system for our city, meaning people who are walking and biking and skateboarding around the city to get around. And it is possible. We're working on something that we're calling the Greenway Links Initiative, which would be taking this active transit system, but really connecting 200 miles of potential greenways across the Metro Boston area. I'm happy to go through some of these images in more detail with all of you. But what if we started thinking about our walking and biking experiences as a full transit system, so that it's all interconnected? Again, these are sometimes difficult when you're talking about tiny little pieces. This is what we have currently in our city, right? It doesn't look like a system. It looks like chopped up little green spaces that people usually go to enjoy. But what if they were part of your everyday experience from getting to point A to point B? And what I think is interesting, again, is that when you envision it as a system with what Wendy was bringing up earlier, trees, comfort, you are maybe more compelled to walk or bike to get somewhere. It's cheap, it's better for the environment, it's better for the city, more people can do it, it addresses some of our density issues, and again, you know, putting this in the seat of a potential Olympics bid, there's some clear corridor alignment, and there are also clear connectivity between neighborhoods that right now are really difficult to get to and from. So this is all to say that I know I said a lot. Basically, let's just transform our public transit system, all of our walkways, only think in system speak. But I believe that the Boston of the future can be more connected. And I think that whether we have autonomous cars, whether we have amazing technologies, whether we have even just a teeny tiny little piece of what we've talked about today, whether it's ferry transportation or something else, if we fundamentally reframe the conversation and make it about people, then we can have some really great experiences in 2030. I think regardless, we're going to see decreased car ownership, increased car shares. We're going to see significant progress toward a sort of a seamless emerald network of greenways. I think that we, can be more visionary and say, what if we just make a commitment to making all of our streets complete? What if we really push transit priority and, think about having gold standard BRT, or at least elements of that gold standard BRT in our lives, so that we can get from one place to another and be happy and healthy. And the biggest takeaway is that in 2030, we're all still just going to be trying to get somewhere. And so whoever gets their way and whoever figures out what we're going to be doing in terms of transportation, it's still just going to be a lot of people in a place trying to get from point A to point B, and it's up to all of us to figure out how to do that the best way. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So the key is getting to a place, and we basically have to revolutionize Boston's transport systems. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to ask the panelists who come forward, because I think each one had a very compelling presentation on hand. And now I'd like to integrate basically all these presentations, all these modes, with a question like, how would the way to work basically look like in 2030? Because I believe technology has a large part to play in basically reducing the need for space on the streets, which at the same time then would fit into what Stacey has presented, saying we need more space in Boston as a community, to making it a connected community, have more space for walking or biking or active modes. And if please the panelists would come forward, and the question was basically asking, okay, how would it look like, how could it be like, and then I'd like to open questions that the audience might have for one panelist or the entire panel. That would be fantastic. So if I would, I'm going to pick Carlo to please start asking you, how would you envision, as a sensible City Lab director, how would you envision that way to work to look like? What can big data do? And
yeah, I would say, big data is not something new. If you look at Élisée Reclus, one of the planners who was writing at the end of the 19th century, and then he was talking about surveying is the first thing we need to do for planning. And surveying, so collecting information from our cities is really the first step. And today that information is incredible. It's the dream of the planner. We can not only survey the physical city, but we can also survey all those flows, what we saw before in many presentations, of flows of people, pedestrians, of cars, and so on. So I think that becomes a very powerful tool of how we can understand how Boston works. And when you look at the Olympics and how they're going to have a big impact on the city, how we can look at those flows and the transformation of those flows as an integral part of the planning process. The most exciting thing, I believe, in addition to this, of using the flows in order to plan, is also how those flows can be made as accessible to people. And then, you can create beautiful feedback loops of how all of us, we can actually look at that information and use that information either to change our behavior or to propose changes in the city. So I think that seems to me like a very interesting thing of how then it's, yes, for planning, we can know big data in the city and we can use it for planning the city, for planning the Olympics. But it's also about how all this data can help us to make different decisions in our life and also propose new ways to live the city.
Thank you. So what I would now move to basically asking basically, so Carlo basically lays out, okay, we have kind of the temporary flows that we need for the Olympic Games, and that we will need to move spectators, but also very essentially Bostonians to get to work. How would you envision then transforming these temporary flows into the permanent ones that could be in 2030?
So, there are, I think, two ways to answer this question. I think from a technical level, we can focus on some really obvious points, whether it's in the BID 2.0 or some other things folks have suggested. Like Wendy very clearly brought up the importance of thinking about the walkability, and we can really dig in there and talk about all the different places we really need to think about all these flows. And of course, I would say the BRT lanes is a great intersection where we can say, all right, we need this for the BID. let's use this as a 3-week pilot and figure it out. But what I would say underpins all of that is starting at the public process level, which again is baseline. So we can talk about the data, we can talk about all of this, but I would say that the best way that we are going to achieve any sort of legacy out of the bid or potentially actually hosting the Olympics is by sitting down with people in their neighborhoods and asking what they need and want from transportation, from housing, and then stepping back and figuring out how the Olympics can contribute to that. And I know that it sounds really basic and sort of not interesting, but that's the answer. It doesn't matter what solutions I put out there until we actually sit down and talk to the community about it.
Right, I think Go Boston 2030 has done a tremendous starter for the community going out with a visioning lab, and I would like to push some ideas that you, for example, mentioned there needs to be Olympic lanes. What about if water could fulfill such a role? What if water could be the Olympic lanes, removing all the concerns about traffic? Sheila, if you would think about, is that something, if the Olympic Games could be a sticking starter for something
I think with the examples that I showed, I wanted to suggest that what we need to do is connect all systems. And I think that's just a very fundamental thing. I'm not about throwing cars off the road or anything like that. But I think that I want to return to this idea of urbanity that was brought up at the beginning of the session. And to think that for me, the question is really not so much what does getting to work look like, but what is the kind of experience, what is the unique urban experience that mobility can offer us? And when you wake up in the morning, first of all, you might not need to get to work. You might need to get to a market, you might need to get to a farm stand, you might be working at home. The first thing that you might do in your trajectory of the mobility would be just to consult your cell phone, for example. So I think that we have to understand that there's going to be a plurality of different things that are coming together around the data and around physical movement. And then there's the other idea that I think we should, in Boston, really be capitalizing on much more, is that every city has in its geography, has a kind of unique DNA, a brand, if you want to call it that, but certain physical characteristics that make that city unique, we hope, from other cities. And the Boston waterfront and also the innovation that's growing around it, like what grows around so many other urban waterfronts, is really not only a part of our history, but I think a really important part of our future. So how can we leverage the Olympics to create a much richer and much more public and a much more interactive urbanity around what I think is one of our central defining features, the waterfront and the rivers in the city. And they may need a little bit of help. That's why I thought that potentially excavating part of the old Roxbury Canal and bringing water past Fort Point Channel to Roxbury would be a way, in addition to the South Bay corridor, that people could actually come by boat to any Olympic venue. That would be really cool if the harbor reached out and accessed all of our homes.
I think that's a very interesting idea. I think it would move water transport and the experience that you could have in Boston with boats, but also with walking and more space available. A really, really interesting and compelling case. If I move now to Wendy, if you're thinking about like the most pleasurable walk and the most pleasurable things that Boston has to offer for the pedestrian, what would you say we could do as Olympics to move that vision forward as well?
Well, I think that the places that people love to walk are places that are filled with other people. I mean, except if you're going for a walk in the woods or you're walking down your street at the end of the day to go home. But if you walk around a city, what people enjoy is being with other people. So I think what we need to think about in terms of the Olympics and the impact, certainly within the city of Boston, is how to create some corridors in parts of the city that may not have corridors that feel lively and feel engaged. So for example, those are people who can walk down Newbury Street or walk down Mass Ave, we have that already. But I think some of the interesting places to think about in terms of a legacy from the Olympics for walkability would be looking at the Sportsman's Tennis Club and where it's located and how people get to and from that, because that's not a place that feels terribly walkable. And thinking about the mix of land uses that lie between the sports club and transit stations, for example. I think getting into the fine grain and the nitty-gritty is really important. And also, I think, as I mentioned in my talk, I think looking at some of those issues at places away from the venues where people are getting to and from transit. So for me, that would be the exciting thing. I think Boston has lots of terrific places to walk, but there are also lots of places that aren't so terrific. And I think looking at the Olympics, looking at where the venues end up, and thinking about that and how we leave that legacy behind for the people that live in Boston permanently. I think the visitors that come here are going to be treated to a very different experience, because wherever you're going, if you're going to see an Olympic event, you're going to be with other people. So a lot of that excitement, we need to meet the basics, but a lot of the excitement that goes into walking to those venues is going to come because you're doing it with other people. If you think about going to a sporting event now, you're walking with other people. It's a celebratory event. But I think what the leave behind is what is along those routes, how we think about those connections and those networks.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think now that ties actually really nicely into what Kent had presented, because it comes from a community perspective. It comes from connecting the experience of walking with the location of housing, with the mobility in itself of that location, and especially how the community will benefit or can benefit from something like this, how they decide on housing and mobility options. If you would take a look at, or pick any bigger, we could pick with that circle, or maybe probably point at anything, how would you envision these three to interact?
Well, I think just generally, I am hoping that the city, like most cities, will rethink the zoning to emphasize compact, vibrant, walkable communities. I think that's really where you have to start. And I'm pleased that Boston has started a process to rethink that. In fact, there's an RFP where the proposals were due Sunday night, so we're part of one team to do that. Then, right here in Kendall Square, if you want to walk to a grocery store or a pharmacy, you're out of luck. So this is not a walkable community right here. It's really about getting the housing and the workplaces and all the third places in the right, proximity is the proper density. Then it's about connecting these places, and I've just personal experience. So I ride my bike in from Jamaica Plain. It's too far to walk. Fantastic experience for about 4 of the 5 miles, and that other mile was hell. I ride up along the Emerald Necklace, then I hit Route 9, and there's no way to cross that. There's no light, there's no crosswalk. Then I ride along another beautiful, it's better than anything in Copenhagen. And then I hit the Landmark Center and have to go down over the BU Bridge, and that's absolute hell. And then I ride along the Charles. So if you could fix those gaps, and I think there's examples of that all over the city, it would, I think, dramatically improve the experience, the walkability, the bikeability of Boston. And I'm hoping that the Olympics will be an opportunity to rethink that infrastructure and upgrade it. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to sort of give that a push.
Okay, well, so thank you very much. I'd like to open questions to the audience. I see there's already the first question.
Hi, I'm Mike Stanley from TransitX. It's a local startup that's developing an autonomous mobility solution to replace cars in mass transit. And I want to ask Ken Larson, he mentioned autonomy, vehicle sharing, electrification as important transit characteristics. But you didn't mention personal rapid transit, and neither did anybody else on the panel. Many people believe PRT could be a key solution. 4 systems now are in operation worldwide, so I'd just like to ask, why would nobody mention personal rapid transit as a potential future solution?
I think it's one solution. I think its applications, in my opinion, in many cities is limited, but I'm for having a whole mix of modes. That's why I showed that slide with all the little animations, and I think personal rapid transit could be an interesting solution. I would personally rather just see the bike lanes upgraded. I think it's more bang for your, for the buck. Sorry?
Not everyone biked,
Well, no, but we're looking at then the little three wheels, which are bikes with a pedal that you can operate and get into the detail. But the idea is that it can respond to your physiology. If you're an elderly person, you can ride it at a slower speed in electric mode. If you're an athlete, you have to work hard and put more human energy into it to go faster. There can be all kinds of mappings. I think it's to democratize access to bike lanes, so be accessible to business people and women in skirts and disabled people and a lot of other people that don't ride in bike lanes for a whole myriad of reasons. I think if you look at the profile of people that actually ride bikes in the city, it's actually fairly narrow, and there are ways, I think, to expand that. Building proper bike lanes is one way to address the problem of safety, but I think there are other vehicles that can do that as well.
The reason why is because bicycles, some type of bicycles.
Okay, I'm talking about bikes and bikes.
I think we can discuss, I think personal rapid transit is certainly a mode in the mix, but I feel like because of the increasing urbanization and the space that is pre-existing in city, that it has to be very wisely used. I think that's across all 5 panels that theme has come out very strongly. Is there anyone there? Oh, please, go ahead.
Many of you made the point that good transportation is good for business, good for property values, good for all of those kinds of things that have to do with money. What's become clear to me over the last few years is that around the world, you have a lot of people with a lot of money buying up the best properties in cities all around the world. So here we are with a community that's looking at how to improve ourselves. We improve ourselves, but perhaps what happens is we improve ourselves out of our cities so that Chinese billionaires, Russian billionaires, Danish, whatever, they come and buy properties and they're there for a month out of a year. And you hollow out the city in some way. So this is not your problem as transportation designers, but transportation is part of that equation. How do we ensure that we improve our cities, but improve our cities in such a way that we don't improve ourselves out of them for a diverse population of all kinds of social and economic strata?
It's a good question, and you probably saw a couple days ago in the Globe, I think the second series of articles about the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Not to get too political here at MIT, but it called for a massive reform of our planning agency here in Boston. And I think that what we haven't talked about tonight is if we're going to get any of these things, we're going to need both public and private sector funding. So in that way, development is the one of the important agents for achieving a change in a relatively short order of time in the city. And I brought up the BRA because I think if there can be the right zoning and the right legal mandates for diversity, for mixing, for affordable housing, and all of that, we could have a development model in Boston similar to what Hamburg has had for the last 10 years, and that is one of the hottest brands. They started with nothing because it was a bombed-out harbor, and there is a great deal of international ownership, land ownership, but there are very strict guidelines for how buildings are developed. And the coolest thing is that the streets and the ground floor of every building is part of a very rich, very forward-thinking public agenda. And I think if we did something like that would tie together sidewalks, streets, and ground floors, it could really be a different way of achieving development, which is needed.
Yeah, and if I can add something, very, very good point. But let me say something. If you look at the city of the past century. Think about a city that Le Corbusier and the modernists thought about in the 1920s and 30s. Well, this city was a city where everything was divided. In the Charte d'Athènes in 1932, they write, we need to have a city where there's a place for living, a place for working, a place for leisure, and connections. And if you think about that, that's absurd, because you clone different cities, and you use them very little. Just one for night, one for day, use space in a very inefficient way. So we're all familiar with then what, after World War II, many people, Jane Jacobs in this country, but many others around the world, actually promoted the idea of mixed-use development so that you use the city in a more efficient way. I think that today, something that could take some of the pressure you're referring to out of our cities is the fact that we can be even more flexible and go into the way of, we're all familiar with co-working. We're now working in Paris with this idea of co-living. Can you actually think about the same idea of how this can apply to the community of co-making? When you combine that, what you see is actually you can use the square foot in a much more efficient way, and so probably you can take some of the pressure out of the city centers. And what I'm saying, think about as an example, just a very simple thing. Think about Airbnb and what it did. So it's zero cost, without adding one brick, without adding extra cost in terms of heating or air conditioning. There you built the largest ever hotel chain on the planet just by using unused capacity. And in a similar way, I think that by 2024, we'll have many ways to use some of our space in a better way. I mean, we see it also in this building here, in other buildings, and the idea of how our flexibility, the increased flexibility we have today, can also help us to use the square foot in a better way. And that can actually be one of the good things looking forward, that will reduce some of the pressure we have today in the center of our cities that is based on an old planning paradigm.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so one of the issues that I think we need to be thinking about is that the reason that good walking conditions create higher prices is the scarcity of places that are good to walk. And one of the things we really need to think about, not just in Boston, but around everywhere in the United States, is creating a lot more places that are good to walk and that have decent transit, and thereby sharing that wealth, creating, if you will, a much broader base on which we can build. So one of the things Walk Boston is doing right now, we're working in communities across Massachusetts. We're working in Springfield, we're working in Fall River, we're working in New Bedford, we're working in a lot of communities, low-income communities that want to be more walkable. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle. We should, absolutely, your question is right on the money, and I think it's very, very important as we're thinking about the Olympics. But I think what we want to do is have more places that have better transportation choices and better mobility, and thereby help to balance the system so that there's not such scarce supply that the prices around every subway station go through the roof.
I'd like to go back to the question about equity. So I think it's an important question. And Sheila, I'm pleased, raised the example several times of Hamburg. So we actually have a major agreement now with Hamburg. And what is fascinating about Hamburg is they have really pioneered the use of good public policy to achieve equity. In fact, I think of it as a triad. So you have good public policy, development agreement, and Hoppen City has to subsidize a grocery store or a daycare center, for example, written into the development contract, combined with good design, combined with increasingly with the focus on good technology. If you have good public policy, good design, and good technology, you can really achieve a lot. Now, it's also interesting about Hamburg. They are in competition with Boston for the 2024 Olympics. They've designed a much more walkable scheme for Hamburg than Boston. I met with the Hamburg Olympics Committee 2 weeks ago, and I had an opportunity to compare the two, and I'm hoping it's out on a peninsula in the harbor. But I'm hoping that Boston can develop a richer solution that ties together different neighborhoods without losing that focus on having the ultimate walkable event.
So just by irony, so I was born and raised in Germany, so I'm actually German. And the one thing you all are very praising, and I really love my country, don't get me wrong. But what Hamburg does have that Boston might have or not have is they have really high taxes. So we're talking the top earners are paying 65% in taxes. That's where this entire movement of equity comes from. That's where the movement of being able to invest into these large-scale infrastructure comes from. So just as an addition to this, but please, there's a next question. Go ahead.
I want to thank you very much for putting on this event. My name is John DeMoncho, and I've been involved with the Media Lab at the school for some years. And it's that type of involvement that I want to speak to for just a moment. You must have encountered and will encounter many views on the desirability of having the Olympics in Boston. The two or three things I'd want you to think about in answering that question, though it's not the question you're posing. You're posing how would we do it if it happened. One is that it's going to take longer than 11 years to achieve the sort of Boston that you're looking for. When I say you, I mean the people in this room and those beyond who share your views. It's going to take more than 15 years, more than 20, more than 30. Look to the major achievements in Boston today, which many would look to and be proud of. They began on the urban battlefield of 1968. The time that it takes to get something good done and in place is extraordinarily long, but no longer than the typical professional life. The life as a professional. The second point about answering that question is to whether the community trusts the entity that will be managing this process. If my statement that it takes longer to produce good results, if the results are very good for the Olympics, you'll want to design the management structure that it can continue the task of developing Boston's qualities without being cut off in midstream. Finally, it seems to me crucial in all of this is that we find a way of uniting in making common ground with every one of these interests that you've cited and others will cite. And the problem at the moment is that nobody can imagine what that financial, political, and social mechanism is. I'd encourage some design effort on that as well as on the modes. Thank you very much.
But I think the panel should go first.
I don't think it was a question, I just think it was a set of reflections, a comment.
I agree, and it should be a long process for change, but I think the people that have presented here looked at it as the Olympic Games as an opportunity, as a transformer of the current way of thinking, as uniting different entities, and the focus will become on process, how to engage academia, how to engage the public, and how to get these connected communities and a shared vision moving forward.
But if I can say something to what John said, I think the first part really resonates about the time. And I think if you look at the past Olympics, you see some of them were really a big success. Think about Barcelona or Munich, and some of them were a disaster. And I think the reason for that is some of them looked at the very long term, Barcelona, actually, they were at a time of crisis. They didn't even want to bid for the Olympics. They had very little money. They decided, well, we're going to do transformations for the city, and yes, in the meanwhile, we're going to do the Olympics. That was the idea of the mayor. In other cases, I think about Athens, they actually focus on the Olympics and those 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks are gone after the Olympics, and then today they have actually disaster in terms of the city, in terms of the debt that they had for doing. So I think the time dimension is very important. If the Olympics can be timed with the longer transformations of the city, then it has a chance of being a great success. But actually, if it is focused on those 2 weeks in this kind of shorter time frame, then we see from the past a lot of failures.
I would only respond by saying I always listen to what John has to say very carefully. But I think that one thing that some of the new technologies are offering is a much lighter systems that can be deployed, BRT versus subways or bike lanes versus widening roads. And so I do think there are some solutions that can be realized in a fairly short time frame if there's the political will.
And I would just very quickly, I think in a lot of conversations, there's an immediate focus on what will it be like when the Olympics are here, and whether you think the Olympics are a great idea or not a great idea. I think that there's an opportunity in the bid process itself, because it forces the city to, in a very fast moment, say, okay, we have to deal with our transportation issues, and we have to deal with our housing issues, and it's an opportunity to get a lot of people together who don't always talk to each other rapid fire and say, regardless if the Olympics come or not, we need a vision for our future. And if we look at the Olympic bid in that frame, it can be beneficial in the long term.
Boston has always had these, transformative infrastructures historically, and some of them have been done relatively quickly. I'm thinking about the filling in of Mill Pond in the North End, which was a land reclamation project, which was done in 20 years. An enormous amount of land was moved. I'm thinking about Back Bay, which, if I'm not mistaken, unfolded over 2 decades, 2.5 decades maybe. I'm thinking about all the different work at Fort Point Channel. I'm thinking about the historic ways in which Boston redefined itself by shaping its infrastructure in relatively short periods of time, certainly less than 50-year increments of time.
Zipcar, Uber.
Zipcar, Uber. So I think that there is a question of will, of political will and of public will, that is also perhaps related to John's comment about transparency and about the accountability and the trust that the management of such a big venture like the Olympics could or couldn't have amongst the public. So I think that time is the least of my concerns. I think it's really more about our will and about finding the reason to do these things again, to kind of grabbing some courage and really using an event like the Olympics to kind of move forward with these things.
So thank you very much. I just get signaled, okay, we have to slowly move over to the reception area, but please, of those engage with the panelists, they can stay for a little bit longer. And then one final announcement, the elevators will stop working at 8:30, so everyone who needs them, heads up. Thank you very much for coming.